If you asked a modern king or prince what the true price of royalty is, he might smile and speak about duty or tradition, but beneath all the ceremonial beauty of palaces, jewels, and golden crowns lies a much darker truth, one written not in history books, but in bones, blood, deformities, and the tragic lives of men born carrying a genetic burden their ancestors created. This is the hidden world of history's most inbred men, a world where the pursuit of pure royal blood created generations of kings whose bodies and minds were quietly collapsing even as the world bowed before them. From ancient Egypt to medieval Europe, from the Inca Empire to the Hawaiian chiefdoms, rulers believed their blood was divine and must remain untouched by common blood. This belief, repeated for centuries, created an invisible genetic trap, each cousin marriage tightening the noose a little more, each uncle-niece pairing bringing the family one step closer to collapse. By the time we arrive at the notorious Habsburg dynasty, the most extreme example of royal inbreeding, the consequences are so visible that scientists can identify a Habsburg simply by looking at their face. Their famous Habsburg jaw, the long drooping nose, the thick lips, the protruding chin, all of these were not random features, but inherited signs of centuries of intermarriage. The tragedy of Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg ruler, became a symbol of what happens when a royal bloodline becomes an echo chamber of repeating genes. Born in 1661 to parents who were uncle and niece, Charles inherited genetic damage from generations of repeated inbreeding. His family tree barely resembled a tree at all. It looked more like a tangled knot with the same names repeated over and over. Charles's jaw was so deformed he could barely chew, his tongue so heavy he struggled to speak, and his body so frail that he needed assistance to perform the simplest tasks. He spent his life surrounded by advisors who treated him as a symbolic king rather than a real ruler, while he himself was terrified by his own body, convinced that a supernatural curse haunted him. But Charles was not cursed by magic. He was cursed by his ancestors' obsession with keeping royal blood pure. His genetic similarity was so extreme that scientists later estimated he had more inbreeding than a child born from a brother-sister union. Yet Charles II was only one chapter in a much larger story. The Habsburgs had already been accumulating genetic damage for centuries. Don Carlos, the mentally unstable son of Philip II, was another tragic example. His parents were first cousins, and his grandparents had married within the same small circle. Don Carlos was born with a twisted spine, a misshapen skull, and emotional instability that frightened everyone around him. His violent outbursts, cruelty, and unpredictable behavior became so dangerous that his own father imprisoned him, not out of spite, but out of fear for what his son might do if allowed to rule. But Europe was not the only place where royal inbreeding created fragile heirs. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs practiced sibling marriage to preserve their divine lineage. DNA analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy reveals that his parents were brother and sister. This explains his clubbed foot, fragile bones, and numerous medical issues. Far from the strong, powerful ruler depicted in statues, Tutankhamun was likely a boy who struggled to walk, let alone rule. Imagine being considered a living god while your body collapses under the weight of diseases you never had a chance to avoid. In Hawaii, high-ranking chiefs married close relatives to maintain their spiritual power, known as mana. In the Mayan world, royal families also practiced uncle-niece marriages. Across the world, royal bloodlines became tight, enclosed circles that trapped their heirs in a cycle of genetic decline. The consequences were not only physical: mental health issues, infertility, vision problems, immune deficiencies, and early death became common patterns among royal families. And because the stakes were so high, it's because the heirs to thrones controlled armies, wealth, and political alliances. Their suffering affected entire nations. When a king was weak, sickly, or mentally unstable, the entire kingdom became vulnerable. Charles II's frail rule directly contributed to the War of Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that reshaped European power. Tutankhamun's fragile health left Egypt's 18th dynasty unstable. Don Carlos's instability created fear and chaos in the Spanish court. These were not isolated tragedies. They were political earthquakes triggered by genetics. Yet, despite all the consequences, royal families continued to marry within their own bloodlines. Why? Because power is addictive, and fear of losing it is stronger than fear of genetic collapse. Marrying cousins kept land, armies, and wealth within the family. Marrying outsiders was seen as dangerous, unpredictable, risky. To kings, a deformed son was still preferable to an outsider who might seize power. And so, generation after generation, the cycle continued. But the cost was enormous. Behind the portraits and royal robes were men who suffered quietly, kings who could not walk without pain, princes who could not form sentences, heirs who died before their first birthday, royal families that collapsed under their own genetic weight. Even today, when we look at old portraits of the Habsburgs, we see not just kings, but victims of a political system that valued purity over health. The long chins, the drooping faces, the hollow eyes, they are silent reminders of how deeply their bodies were shaped by choices made centuries before they were born. This is not a story meant to mock those who suffered. In fact, it is the opposite. It is a story of human tragedy, of young men who were born into impossible expectations, of rulers who lived in pain behind palace walls, of families trapped by their own beliefs. Inbreeding creates predictable scientific outcomes: increased genetic disorders, higher infant mortality, weakened immune systems, deformities, and mental instability. These patterns were magnified in royal families because the same genes circulated for hundreds of years. A single harmful mutation could reappear again and again, becoming stronger each time. And yet, generation after generation, the practice continued, shaping not only the lives of individuals, but the destinies of empires. The story of history's most inbred men is not just a medical or genetic story, it is political, emotional, and profoundly human. These men were born into wealth and power, yet many of them experienced more suffering than the poorest peasants in their kingdoms. They wore crowns, but their bodies bore the hidden cracks of royal tradition. Their portraits remain in museums, but their real lives filled with pain, confusion, isolation, and physical fragility are stories that history is only now beginning to understand. And this is only the beginning. In Part 2, we explore even more bloodlines, more scientific detail, and more stories of men whose bodies became battlegrounds for the decisions of their ancestors. Because the darkest truth of royal history is this: sometimes the greatest threat to a king is not an enemy army, it is his own blood. From the moment historians first opened the dusty archives of fallen empires and examined the fragile bones of long-dead rulers, they discovered a pattern so consistent, so haunting, that it reshaped everything we thought we knew about royalty. The most powerful men in history often carried within their veins the seeds of their own suffering. Part 2 of this story dives deeper into that forgotten world, peeling back the remaining layers of secrecy that once protected the reputations of kings and exposing even more dramatic consequences of royal inbreeding. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, royal families treated their bloodlines like sacred relics, believing that mixing with outsiders would weaken the throne. But as we move further into the political labyrinths of history, we find that the very walls built to protect the dynasty often became the prisons that destroyed it. Consider the tragic case of Emperor Ferdinand I of the Holy Roman Empire, a Habsburg ruler whose inbreeding coefficient was among the highest of his time. Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy so severe that he would collapse during ceremonies, shake uncontrollably during political negotiations, and wake up with no memory of events. His advisors learned to read the tremors in his hands as warnings that a seizure was coming. His letters reveal a man who lived in constant fear of losing control, not of his empire, but of his own body. His condition was so debilitating that major decisions for the empire were often delayed or altered based on his health. Imagine ruling a continent-sized empire while your own brain worked against you. Yet Ferdinand still attempted to govern with dignity, masking his vulnerability beneath the heavy robes of imperial authority. Next, we turn to the Portuguese branch of the Habsburgs, where the cycle repeated itself. King Afonso VI of Portugal, born with severe developmental disabilities, brain lesions, and muscle weakness, was unable to walk without assistance. His mind often drifted into confusion, and he had violent episodes followed by long periods of exhaustion. His own mother declared him unfit to rule. His wife publicly stated that he was incapable of consummating their marriage. His brother eventually seized the throne, using Afonso's condition as justification. Afonso spent the rest of his life wandering palace halls like a ghost, stripped of power, stripped of dignity, and silently carrying the genetic legacy of centuries of royal intermarriage. In Russia, the Romanovs suffered their own genetic catastrophe, not from inbreeding, but from the limited genetic diversity of European royal marriage networks. The infamous hemophilia gene entered the family through Queen Victoria of Britain, whose massive royal descendants spread the disease across Europe. Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne, spent his childhood wrapped in bandages and medical fear. A simple bruise could cause internal bleeding. A stumble could become life-threatening. His parents' desperation led them into the hands of Rasputin, a mystic whose influence contributed to the fall of the Romanov dynasty. Here we see another truth. Even when inbreeding does not directly deform bodies, the consequences of fragile royal bloodlines can reshape the fate of nations. When Alexei cried in pain, an empire trembled. When Rasputin whispered into the empress's ear, history cracked. The Ottoman Empire, though less inbred than European dynasties, had its own system of internal collapse. While they avoided cousin marriage for long periods, their practice of keeping princes confined in the cafes, the cage, created mental and physical deterioration. Princes were isolated for decades, allowed no social development, no real contact with the world, and no normal relationships. When they finally ascended the throne, many were mentally fragile, socially unprepared, and emotionally broken. Sultan Ibrahim I, after 20 years of confinement, emerged with paranoia, instability and uncontrollable impulses. Though not caused by inbreeding, the psychological damage was equally catastrophic. And it serves as a reminder that royal systems, whether through genetic or psychological imprisonment, often produced rulers who were victims of their own institutions. In Hawaii, where sibling marriage was considered sacred among high chiefs, inbreeding produced rulers who were revered as demigods, but also suffered from chronic weakness, congenital deformities, and high infant mortality rates. The same patterns appear in the Mayan, Incan, and ancient Persian empires, where rulers believed divine blood required divine isolation. As we examine these civilizations, we see the same genetic signature repeating across continents: clubbed feet, elongated skulls, jaw deformities, fragile immune systems, mental instability, short lifespans, and royal heirs who spent more time in bed than on the battlefield. But the most haunting example outside Europe comes from the Egyptian 18th dynasty, where Tutankhamun's family practiced repeated sibling and cousin marriages for generations. The mummy of Tut's father, Akhenaten, shows deformities in the skull, hips, and chest. Tutankhamun himself had a clubbed foot, displaced bones, severe malaria, and immune deficiencies. His ability to walk unaided was nearly impossible, and yet the world remembers him as a golden king, his mask flawless, his coffin majestic, the treasures around him shimmering with godlike beauty. The truth beneath the gold tells a different story. Tutankhamun was a boy trapped in a failing body, forced to play the role of a divine ruler while his bones cracked under the weight of inherited weakness. As Part 2 continues to unravel the consequences of inbreeding, one thing becomes clear. Royal families were not simply powerful, they were profoundly vulnerable. And the most heartbreaking part is that many of these men knew it. They felt the weakness in their own bones. They saw the deformities in the mirror. They heard the whispers behind palace doors. They understood, even if they could not admit it publicly, that their suffering was not destiny, it was design. A design created by ancestors obsessed with purity. A design sustained by political fear. A design defended by priests, advisors, and scholars who believed divine blood was more important than human health. And yet, the final chapters of these bloodlines reveal a twist that history rarely emphasizes. Inbreeding did not just weaken kings, it destroyed empires. Spain collapsed under Charles II. Egypt's 18th dynasty ended after Tutankhamun. The Romanovs fell soon after Alexei's illness, empowered Rasputin. The Habsburgs fractured into isolated branches. In every case, the very strategy meant to protect power ultimately shattered it. The walls built to keep royal blood pure became tombs for the future. But the most powerful lesson of this entire story, the lesson Part 2 brings into sharp focus, is that history's most inbred men were not villains. They were not symbols of failure. They were victims of systems they never built, victims of traditions they never chose, victims of bloodlines they never shaped. And as we reach the end of this long journey through centuries of royal suffering, there remains one final image, a symbolic ending for the entire saga. Picture a king standing alone in a candlelit hall. The portraits of his ancestors tower above him, each face stretched by the same jawline, the same lips, the same tired eyes. He touches his own face, realizing he carries their features, their flaws, their pain. The crown on the table glimmers with gold, but he no longer sees it as a symbol of glory. He sees it for what it truly is, a circle of metal forged not only from wealth and power, but from centuries of sacrifice, fear, superstition, and genetic cost. And slowly, almost gently, he lowers the crown onto his head, not as a celebration of power, but as an acknowledgement of history. A history written not by victories or conquests, but by blood. A bloodline that survived empires, endured deformities, and carried its kings through centuries of darkness. And as the candles flicker, the king whispers the final truth that all royal bloodlines eventually discover. It was never the crown that was cursed. It was the price paid to wear it.